And so a quick introduction, just to let you guys know that she's a professor in the School of Public and International Affairs at NC State and the director of the Fire Chasers Research Project. The Fire Chasers have been working with Type 1 and 2 incident management teams, agency administrators, and local cooperators on improving co-management of jurisdictionally complex wildfire events since 2008. Trained as an organizational and community psychologist, Branda specializes in the design and governance of networks in the public sector. Her passion lies in creating more robust institutions and systems for addressing complex policy issues. So welcome to Branda. We also have today with us Shannon McGovern, who is Branda's doctoral student. Do you want to just say a quick word about the Fire Chasers project or what your involvement is or anything?
Yeah, so I'm a second-year PhD student. I'm also a Tar Heel. I went there for undergrad. So I definitely bleed blue more so than red. Sorry, Branda. But I joined the Fire Chasers a little over 2 years ago now. And it's just such a wonderful experience getting to see kind of inside Branda's world. It's actually really cool what she does.
It's a weird world.
Well, thank you for that. So without further ado, I think we're ready to have you share your screen, Branda.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me. This is actually my second opportunity to present to this group. I did, I think I met with your class 3 years ago. Gavin was teaching it at that point in time.
Yep.
So it's always a pleasure to get to be here. Yeah, I got to be there in person last time, but good to get to see you, everybody, if it's only on flat screens. Let me see if I can share my screen out. Yes, all right. So as Anna said, I'm in the School of Public and International Affairs in the Department of Public Administration, and back over 10 years ago now, I met up with a colleague of mine, Tati Stillman, who is in the College of Natural Resources. She's now at Duke University, and we launched the Fire Chasers. And it came out of a weird request from the U.S. Forest Service at the time to basically saying, we believe networks are important for how we need to manage wildfire, but we don't know what that means. Can you help us understand that? And so my background is in organizational community psychology, and I specialize in social networks and the creation of sort of networks and governance networks in complex problem areas. And Tati specializes in wildfire and wildfire policy. And so it was kind of a two great tastes that taste great together. And we've been on this train ever since. So our website is www.firechasers.ncsu.edu. So if you're interested in more of this work, you're welcome to pop in there. All of the reports and publications off of it are there. And those are fabulous graduate students, Shannon McGovern, who's here with us today, Elliot and Kate. And so today I wanted to talk, a lot of what we do is try and help us help understand how federal systems, state systems, and local systems can play together in very complex areas. And we're interested in the context of disasters and specifically wildfire. So we're talking about systems in which actors who oftentimes have never worked together, may have never even met each other, are now literally sharing a tent for an extended period of time in a very high consequence, high stress, a lot of uncertainty type of situation, like a wildfire event. And so we're really interested in how we get better at doing that, and particularly now how we get better at trying to integrate the stuff that the sort of relationship building and planning and preparedness stuff that happens ahead of an event, and how that governance action sort of carries through during the event, and then also even carries through past the event in terms of the life cycle of the fire, the pre, the during, and then the post recovery and further mitigation. And so what I'm going to be speaking on today is specifically related to a project that we got funded to do through the Joint Fire Science, where they were wanting to know about co-managing. So working in these jurisdictionally complex fires where the fire is moving across multiple jurisdictions, which means you've got to pull people who have individual ultimate authority within their jurisdiction for how to manage the fire, but having to come together collectively because the fire doesn't really care what jurisdiction that it's on, and that what happens on one jurisdiction affects other jurisdictions. So that's sort of the context of this project. And I also want to say, if there's at any point questions that come up or comments, discussion, I'm very comfortable, sort of riffing as we go. So please feel free to interrupt me. I've asked Anna to help moderate that, so you're welcome to put stuff in the chat, and then she can pop things in if that would be more comfortable as well. But feel free to just unmute yourself if you'd like to as well. So the questions I want to talk about today are thinking about jurisdictional complexity, and this became important. I'll talk to a little bit more about why that became important. Also about how we're managing multi-jurisdictional fires and how we improve co-management. And most of the data that's come from this is from a fire watch protocol that we developed over starting in 2017, as well as we did interviews and field site visits. We did interviews on 15 different type 1 and type 2 wildfire incidents. Type 1 and type 2 refer to the highest complexity wildfire events that happen in the United States in 2017 and 2018. And we also did field work on 4 of those incidents. So I want to talk about the new normal of jurisdictional complexity. And this came up as an anchoring question for us because there's a narrative that we've been talking, and it's not only us that have been speaking about this, but this notion that wildfires are getting bigger, they are burning more intensely, fire behavior is becoming more erratic because of a lot of factors. And that as a result, there's an increased need for being able to manage multi-jurisdictional fires, that we're increasing the jurisdictional complexity of what it means to manage fires. And while we believe that is true, and it makes sense that it's true, there wasn't actually we don't have a lot of data to really talk about what this new normal of jurisdictional complexity looks like as fires have been changing over time. We know that fires are changing dramatically, and you guys have probably, I'm guessing 10 years ago, you couldn't name a wildfire, and now you could probably name a few of them. It used to be we'd never get invited to the disaster conferences, and now we get to be, center stage on them. It's wildfires all the rage in the disaster community these days, whereas it used to be not. Which just in the time that I've been here. I've been working in the field since 2008. It has dramatically shifted in terms of its presence in sort of the American consciousness as a disaster we need to think about. So we started thinking about what just jurisdictional complexity was in general, and what do we mean when we were talking about jurisdictionally complex fires. And one of the first ways we can think about that is just how many large-scale complex wildfire events are taking place. And so we think about this in terms of type 1 and type 2 incident management teams. So these are teams, these are the elite, best of the best incident management teams that when fires hit a level of complexity that are beyond the capabilities of the local and state level units, that they bring in these teams. So these teams are regional and federal in nature, and they come in to manage the incident. And we also think about it in terms of the type of fire organizations that we set up. So how many unified command structures, what sort of joint delegations of authority, those sorts of things. So thinking about how complex the fire organizations are becoming that we are pulling together. And that becomes important because it's through the fire organizations that jurisdictional complexity becomes governed, if you will, from an organizational standpoint. And then we also think about jurisdictional complexity in terms of just the sheer scope of jurisdictions that are being affected, both at the local level, thinking about cities and counties, at the state level, in terms of the fire organizations there, like CAL FIRE, Organizational Department of Forestry, and then at the federal level, in terms of the federal land agencies that and the federal system that comes into response. So you think about all of the different folks, even in just the fire operations aspect of a wildfire disaster, not including the emergency response operations, it can get really complex on a large fire. And then we can also think about that in terms of how many different levels of government get involved, federal, tribal, state, and local, because we know that things are a lot harder to coordinate between levels of government than they are within levels of government. And so, as I mentioned before, there's a challenge there because there's not a good picture about how jurisdictional complexity is changing on large wildfires. And this is important as an organizational psychologist, because when we have a changing task environment, when the world we're working in is changing dramatically, but we're using old institutions to respond to that world, it suggests that there may be some disconnects there, that we may be stretching systems in ways that they weren't necessarily designed to do it. So like one of the framing questions I oftentimes have conversations with incident commanders about is that if you were to design the incident command system today, instead of, relative to the 1970s, would it look different? Would we have designed it differently today than it looks now because of its roots back in the world that was in play in the 1970s? So I want to kind of just talk through some of the data on this, starting with just, what do we mean by jurisdictionally complex fires in terms of type 1 and type 2? And I'm going to be presenting data from 2018 primarily. That's a good year to present data on because it was a big year in terms of wildfire, just to kind of get us a picture of the sort of national portfolio of what wildfires are looking like. So 2018, the Northwest was exhausted. So Oregon and Washington got clobbered that year, as well as the Great Basin. These are organized by what we call GACs, the Geographic Area Command Centers. So these are the centers that where resources primarily are coordinated out of. So you can kind of see where the southern region, Northern Rockies, the Southwest, less activity that year, up to there was 27 type 1 and type 2 fires in the Northwest and 25 in the Great Basin. So lots of fire activity. In terms of the number of jurisdictions impacted, this graph creates a heat map, if you will. So the way you sort of read this is like a temperature stick. The darker colors is bad. So the darker the colors, the more jurisdictions that are affected. So this looks at sort of proportion of the number of jurisdictions for fires for that area. Basically, the takeaways from this graph are that nearly 2/3 of the type 1 and type 2 wildfires in 2018 involved 3 or more jurisdictions. And our most complex wildfire had 13 different jurisdictions involved. Now, if you think about fire organizations, and if you know much about the incident management system and sort of how we string together governance through unified command structures and joint delegations of authority and things like that to pull jurisdictions together into what we call sort of a coherent, coordinated response to the fire, 13 jurisdictions is an incredible number of jurisdictions to try and negotiate around and between. And in another project, we can show you what some of the fire organizations ended up looking like that we're trying to coordinate across all of those jurisdictions. In terms of where it all happened, probably not surprising to anyone, Northern California, Southern California, and the Northwest. And our big one, our number 13, I believe was the Mendocino complex. Shannon's Bobby. It was the Mendocino, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. So that was our 13 jurisdiction fire up there. But we saw lots of complexity in terms of the fire organizations that were being pulled together. So we also wanted to look at the jurisdictional levels in terms of if you take those 13 jurisdictions, for example, on that fire and say, okay, are those all federal agencies or are those all state level actors or local level actors? What does that look like? And what we found was that nearly half of all the type 1 and type 2 fires involve 3 or more levels of government. And this is really important because our past research has shown us that it's much harder for us to coordinate and navigate the cultural differences between federal agencies with each other are far less than the cultural differences between, for example, federal agencies to state agencies, particularly when you're talking about wildland fire operations. They tend to have very different missions moving from federal to state to local. And so the coordination across levels of government is much more complex as opposed to within levels of government. The BLM and the U.S. Forest Service and the National Park Service, they have some challenges coordinating together, but they're pretty practiced in being able to do that. And they have a lot of very common systems. So just to kind of wrap up a national picture here, this is what it looks like. Again, lots of complexity. This is the color map here. Darker colors means the greater percentage of fires involving 3 or more jurisdictions. So this Northern California bit having lots of complexity. These circles here represent the range of jurisdictions per fire. So between 1 and 13. So in Northern California, We had fires with 2 jurisdictions. We had some fires with 13 jurisdictions, Southern California between 1 and 10, those sorts of things. So we're seeing lots and lots of complexity happening there. So the big takeaways there is that type 1 and type 2 fires routinely are having 3 to 4 jurisdictions impacted, representing 3 levels of government. So this is kind of what we've been advocating back to the field, saying that we all need to get comfortable with the idea that this is just what the new normal is in terms of wildland fire operations, and what we need to be able to prepare for, and making sure that the systems we have for responding to that can accommodate that kind of complexity. And it's important to note that none of that complexity analysis includes representation of the private interests. So the large scale ranchers, the timber companies, the folks that oftentimes have the governor on speed dial in their telephone and have airplanes and crews of their own that they're trying to become operationally engaged in the incident. None of what we've talked about so far includes any of those folks. And so, again, the big takeaway that we use this data to talk about is that if we're going to improve fire operations and management on these sorts of large scale fires, it's going to have to involve improving our ability to manage in these multi-jurisdictional fire organizations, and looking at what that means. So we did some evaluation on how we're doing across those 15 fires that I'd mentioned. Short answer is it depends on who you ask. So we used a scale on what we call the network performance of co-management. So this is where we asked agency administrators, people who represented all those different jurisdictions on all those fires over 2017 and 2018, to tell us about how things were going in terms of the extent to which they felt like a coordinated set of fire management objectives were agreed upon by all the affected jurisdictions, or the concerned jurisdictions prioritized maintaining good communication, those sorts of activities. And what we learned is that how we're doing really depends on who you ask. So there's a big difference that we observe between the federal, local, and the state and private. The state and private tended to be the least satisfied and felt that there was the most problems with the co-management side of things, which if you're involved in the fire community is probably not a particularly surprising thing. And we can talk about that a little bit after in terms of some of the reasons for that. The biggest issue that people had was around this item right here. The overall strategy taken in managing this fire was appropriate. So this had some of the greatest divergence between the private and state versus the federal and local. So people disagreed essentially in those groups about the overall strategy. But what was interesting is when you talk to these people, because we talked to all of them, was that the challenges and the solutions that they talked about were remarkably similar across jurisdictions. So it's not like the different jurisdictional levels were sort of thinking about things differently in terms of the sort of abstract ideas and things that they would consider problematic and things that they would consider to be positive. It's just that they were in tension with each other. And so, we've started to talk with the jurisdictions a lot about what I call the conflict cocktail. My first master's degree was in conflict studies, and so that's still kind of near and dear to my heart. And so we talk about the conflict cocktail, and it's where jurisdictional interdependencies, so where jurisdictions have some level of which what happens on one jurisdiction's land has consequences for another jurisdiction. That creates an interdependency between those two jurisdictions. When that occurs, when you have interdependencies, and then you have competing objectives, so when the jurisdictions have different missions and they're trying to accomplish different things, and you have unilateral decision-making where each jurisdiction is kind of running the show on their own jurisdiction the way they want to, you're going to have conflict. It's structurally sort of baked into the model that is going to be a high conflict type of situation. And the conflict cocktail, I think, is useful because it helps us point to where the points of leverage are for resolving these conflicts. So, just like any other, equation, if you turn any of the lower any of these values go, and particularly if you turn them to 0, the conflict goes away. So if you reduce the interdependency, the conflict is reduced. If you align the objectives, the conflict is reduced. Or if you share the decision space so that folks are coming to joint decisions, the conflict is reduced. So that sort of points out where the points of leverage are in the system. So we wanted to talk a little bit about reducing the jurisdictional interdependence. And so we've been talking to folks about all of these different jurisdictional points of leverage for reducing some of the conflicts that's happening on large scale fires. So the first, reducing jurisdictional interdependence. Key questions are like, are there opportunities to mitigate the opportunity for fire to spread between two jurisdictions? So, and there's a lot of innovative efforts that are happening right now in doing this. So low season efforts to establish or strengthen buffer zones and containment lines. There's some really great work. RMRS worked on potential operational delineations where they're trying to find places basically where the wildfire would have the greatest likelihood of being contained or naturally extinguishing itself. So trying to find ways that limit the likelihood that fire is going to spread from one jurisdiction to another. Reduce the interdependency, you reduce the level of conflict. Another thing you would do is increase the alignment of objectives. And we're doing a lot of work in this area in federal policy. There's an effort out there, a framework called the National Cohesive Wildland Fire Management Strategy. And this is really all about that. It's trying to see, can we get a more shared sense of agreement and alignment across the federal, state, and local levels in terms of how we learn to live with fire in these new fire regimes, given the realities that we have. And the general sense is that the more, if we can start to align risk perception, and then we have processes for co-managing decisions during the incident itself, that's going to create that sense of alignment. So this led us to questions about risk perception and are people really diverging significantly in just their understanding of risk and how risk should be managed on a wildfire. And the short answer that we found on this was that risk perceptions appear to differ more in temporal scale than substance. And this was surprising to us because there's a strong narrative in the wildland fire community that argues that essentially that the reason why there's challenges, particularly between state and federal and local actors, is because they just have very different risk perceptions and risk management understandings. And what we found is that that's not, it's true, but in a different way than what we had originally thought. What we found is that the substantive categories of risk were pretty much the same across all actors, no matter who we spoke with. People spoke about human safety, they talked about homes, infrastructure, and communities, they talked about ecosystems and environment, and they talked about sociopolitical and economic impacts of the fire. And in general, they ranked these in about the same way. Human safety, safety of firefighters, safety of communities was always number one. Homes, infrastructure, and the communities themselves was always number two. And then sometimes there was a little bit of disagreement in terms of the ecosystem environment and the sociopolitical and economic. So as a general rule, people sort of thought similarly about these no matter what jurisdictional level they came from. But they thought very differently about them, and they described them very differently in terms of their temporal scale of risk, whether it was immediate tactical, incident level, or long-term risk. So for example, at the immediate tactical, they might talk about risk to firefighter safety, immediate home values threatened, fire suppression impacts on natural resources, and interagency coordination. So what was going on right there on the ground? Should we put the fire line here? Should we not? Those sorts of tactical decisions. At the incident level, it was more firefighter risk exposure hours in terms of a long duration incident, community health risk from prolonged smoke exposure, the fire potential in terms of its impact to communities, threats to endangered species, political risks and negative public perceptions, these sorts of kind of what could happen as a result of this incident overall. Sorry, this is Mojito, everyone. Joe Tembo. Okay. And then when we think about the long-term risk, what we're talking about is oftentimes the post-fire risk, the mudslides, the flooding, the recovery costs, the ecological health of the wildland and associated risk exposure for more intense future wildfires. If we suppress this wildfire, have we just basically kicked the can on the risk for the next wildfire, which is going to be bigger and even more intense? The aesthetic and recreational value of the land, the long-term impacts of the local economies, public and political support of public lands, these sorts of things. So this is where people tended to vary the most in terms of whether they oriented towards this more immediate risk narrative, an incident level risk narrative, or a long-term risk narrative. And one of our insights out of this is that there's really, these things are in tension and trade-off. That one of the reasons this is hard stuff is because these temporal scalings are in tension with each other. And so if you accept risk in one area, or I'm sorry, if you reduce risk in one area, oftentimes you're accepting risk in another area. And a great example of this is what we refer to as the 10 a.m. fire policy. So this has been an historical fire policy where basically the operational goal of success was that the fire is out by 10 a.m. the next day. That was basically the metric upon which we used to evaluate how well we were doing in fire operations. And what we learned in that approach is that we were accepting lots of immediate and tactical risks. So there was a lot of firefighter safety issues and things like that, with going very aggressive and direct on these fires. But we were reducing the incident level risk, but we were also potentially increasing the long-term risk because we were suppressing all the fires rather than letting fires burn in areas where it might have some ecological benefit. I am sorry. Get down, Bob. So when you think about kind of these trade-offs, that if you then reduce the incident level risk, so now what we're trying to do is allow fires to burn in certain areas, reducing some of the risk to firefighter safety and allowing it to be in some ecological benefit where it's possible, taking better advantage of some of the natural barriers. But what that does is sometimes increase the incident level risk. And so these things kind of exist in trade-off with each other. And so here's just an example of one area in terms of a substantive area that everyone agreed was the top priority of risk perception, which was firefighter safety. Everyone agreed that putting firefighter safety first was one of the most important things that should be done. But just consider the different perspectives on what firefighter safety looks like from these quotes here. So you can see down here at the bottom, immediate tactical risk perceptions on that are things like there weren't good safety zones and there's no roads back there. We can't get them out if anything happens. So it's not a good, we can't go in there and our actions can't take move into that space because it's not going to be safe for the firefighters to do that at a tactical level. Moving around here to the incident level, instead of putting one experienced hotshot crew at moderate risk for 2 days, we put 1,000 less experienced firefighters in tactically less risky situations, but over 2 months of continuous risk exposure. So that's a narrative about incident level risk. And then here's one about some of the long-term risks. You know, there's 4,000 acres out there, and that's going to be tough to fight fire in. There's 4,000 acres out there of snags. So a snag is when fire moves through an area and kills off trees, and then you have dead standing trees in the area. Those become very, very treacherous areas for future firefighting because those snags catch fire, they're dried out wood, and they tend to fall and oftentimes and can injure firefighters and kill them who are working in the area. And this last one here, I remember we ended up fighting fire in the same area 3 years in a row, and each year we suppressed it, and the next year it was worse and more dangerous. So kind of taking all of that to heart, that we've got some real structural challenges in aligning objectives, but there's more work that can be done there. We've got some opportunities for reducing jurisdictional interdependence, but all of this requires work ahead of the fire. This is all in the aligning objectives and reducing jurisdictional interdependence during the middle of a firefight is very, very difficult to do. Generally, your major point of leverage during the fire itself is on trying to share the decision space. So creating governance systems of co-management for how it is to co-manage that fire, as opposed to what we call the hot potato approach, which was manage the fire while it's on your jurisdiction, and then as soon as it burns onto another jurisdiction, it then becomes their game to manage. And so we learned a lot about what folks saw as being best practices in this. Lots of stuff that is somewhat commonsensical, but until we start institutionalizing these things, they're not necessarily always happening. So things like early notification of adjacent jurisdictions, making sure that if a fire is on your land and it's within any area of a perimeter that has the ability to threaten another jurisdiction, that you tell them early. Transparent risk management decision processing over, there's a phrase in the wildland fire that talks about highest probability of success with the lowest risk to firefighter safety. And in the fire community, it almost has a lawyer up kind of connotation that all decisions can be justified as being just the highest probability of success with the lowest risk for firefighter safety, and that folks were feeling frustrated that the people weren't sort of critically looking at that phrase. Managing for neighbors' risks as well as your own. So taking your neighbors' interests and objectives into consideration in your operational actions, and thinking about opportunities for threatened jurisdictions to express concerns and participate in strategy and AA meetings. This was an interesting thing from an organizational standpoint. Right now in the incident management system, you sort of your place within the incident management organization is contingent upon you being on fire. So if you are just threatened but not yet on fire, you don't really have a formal role yet in the fire organization. And this creates lots and lots of sort of hand wringing at the boundary land while they're sort of waiting for the fire to come their direction, but not really being operationally as engaged as they would like to be. So we came up with some conversations to have right now, and I think I sent you guys the blog post on that. And a lot of these are just very simple, but communications to the fire and the wildland fire community agency administrators, starting with introducing yourself. We had a lot of agency administrators on fires who had never met each other before they had to try and co-manage a fire together. And so making sure ahead of the fire season that people are getting to know each other. Really talking about how and when we are going to communicate with each other about potential threats. So people found it incredibly frustrating when another jurisdiction had a fire that had the potential to threaten their jurisdiction, and they had to go hunt for information about it. They wanted that jurisdiction to reach out to them, to be proactive in communicating with them about the threat. So sort of bring them in early rather than sort of keep them at arm's length until the threat was really imminent. So being specific about expectations about that, who's going to call who, when are you going to call, like what's the perimeter boundary, those sorts of things. How often are you going to be communicating with each other? What's the mechanism? Are you doing it through AA meetings or text, or agency administrator meetings, through text, phone calls, in-person meetings, those sorts of things. And biggest concerns now and into the future, like what's worrying people? Almost everyone that we spoke with had had areas on the jurisdictional boundary that they were concerned about, but they're not really talking to each other about this a lot. And so we need to increase those conversations. Recognizing risk narratives are going to differ across varying interests. And this one I think is the biggest and most important one. How are they going to communicate concerns with each other and offer assistance when one actor perceives a significant threat from a fire that's on another actor's jurisdiction? Can they initial attack on the other jurisdiction? Can they get involved in the fire operations? Can they get involved in some of the operation planning in terms of where they put in fire line? Those sorts of things. So proactively soliciting input, not waiting for others to offer it, and verbally confirming that everyone's on the same page, just not making assumptions there. So with that, I'm going to stop the share so I can see you all in my tiny little 15-inch screen here. And yeah, anxious to hear questions, comments.
That was great. Thank you. Does anybody have a burning question that they'd like to ask? Sorry.
The wildfire metaphors are just so fun. They keep going. You can make puns all the time.
Thing is, I didn't even intend it. Or otherwise, I can just start off with some of our questions, because I did notice, I'm not seeing anything in chat, so I'm going to rattle on until one of you kind of jumps in. But I did notice three-ish themes that come up, and this happens a lot, where I guess great minds are thinking alike in the class when they have your pre-submitted questions. And one of them was lessons learned. What lessons can we learn from the international scene? Canada, Australia, of course, with their bushfires they're unfortunately getting a lot of practice in this. So, and also it's a vast area, and their states are are pretty large as well. So Andy, do you want to sort of summarize what I just babbled with your question? Your third question, I think. Andy, you out there in a box? I saw you earlier. Okay, that's fine. So Maggie, you also had a question along those lines about lessons learned from other countries, other jurisdictions. Do you want to talk about yours?
Yeah, let me find it. So I asked, I guess, what lessons could be learned or lessons that can be taken from the handling of wildfires in California and Australia that could be applied to the rest of the United States.
That's a great question. Are you thinking in terms of the emergency response operations to it, the wildland fire operations, the land management? Is there a particular zone in there you were thinking, or kind of in a general sense?
I think in a general sense, at the time when I was thinking about it, I was, I guess, thinking about the emergency response, but in a general sense would work as well.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, one of the great things about California is not, working in disasters. You guys probably have this experience. Like everything gets a little twisted in terms of how you speak about it. But the great thing about California is that it's been burning for a lot longer than other places. They have had more complex, jurisdictionally complex fires for, I think, a longer history of managing jurisdictionally complex fires relative to a lot of the other areas. And so they are much more practiced in how to, in doing so. And I think that they also have some more sophisticated systems for representing different interests that are affected, because you're just sort of looking at a different demographic in terms of you've got a pretty high population density relative to a lot of the Mountain West in that area. A lot of the wildland urban, you've got a lot of wildland urban interface where you've got sort of local level fire structure operations folks interacting in closely with the CAL FIRE system. My understanding is that the largest firefighting operation in the world is the U.S. Force, our wildland, our federal system of wildland firefighting. The second largest one is, I believe, CAL FIRE. So their state level fire organization, as I understand it, is the second largest in the world. It's a huge institution. It's large. It's resourced. It has, so they've got a lot more practice in doing things like using unified command, where the state generally gets in unified command with the federal agencies. They just do things a little differently in California because I think they've got the institutions built up because they've had a lot of practice, unfortunately, with having to do that. Whereas I think some of the other regions in the United States, we just haven't had a lot of these big multi-jurisdictional wildland urban interface fires that we're starting to see now.
Yeah, thank you. That's interesting. I didn't realize it was that big in California. I mean, it makes sense. I guess I just didn't understand or kind of fully grasp the scale of that. But thank you.
Yeah, great. Good question, Maggie. Thank you so much, Branda. Sort of along those same lines, I did get several questions that spoke about what can we learn, or what are some of the management strategies of indigenous populations, and why aren't we paying more attention to that? Fern, you asked a question along those lines. Emma, you did. Actually, Rachel, you did as well. So any one of you can pull out your question specifically, or Branda, I'll just let you run with that.
I could add in my piece of that, which is just I've read about like indigenous practices around fire management itself, but given that your focus is specifically around the governance piece of fire management and less so about like, what is a specific fire technique we're using. I was curious if there has also been, like, it sounds like at least in some circles, there's been more looking to those practices in terms of the techniques. So I'm curious if there's also some looking towards the practices in terms of governance and sharing management.
It's huge. Right now, I think it's actually, I think, one of the more exciting things that's happening right now. One of the biggest challenges that we're facing in living with this new world order of fire is the fact that fire in the landscape is now, it's always had an ecological role. It will continue. The fire is not going anywhere. And you know, we're seeing some ecological shifts that suggest that fire is going to continue to be on the landscape in a much more prominent way than it's done in the past. One of the sort of strategies or solutions that are out there is that we need to get more fire on the land. It's not less fire, it's more fire. We need to get more prescribed fire on the landscape to treat these ecological areas, get them cleaned out. We've had this history of fire suppression that's allowed undergrowth to build up, so we get a lot of the ladder fuels, which is what's creating some of the problem. This is a really hard thing to do because there's while people may sort of generally agree that this is a good idea, if you happen to live in that area, fire is scary for a lot of people. It has a lot of health concerns in terms of the smoke that comes along with it. It can create, a lot of the people have respiratory challenges and things like that. So the ability right now to get fire on the landscape in a prescribed burn sort of way when it's not in the middle of fire season, there's a lot of barriers to doing that as an agency. Indigenous communities have been burning on their lands as a fuels treatment and an ecological sort of management and maintenance and as a cultural practice for a long time. Many of them are very involved in this. Obviously, you don't want to speak monolithically about them, but a lot of our indigenous communities have rich histories of managing fire and managing their land using fire. And so I think there's a big interest right now within the fire community to try and understand how you create a culture that sees fire as a natural part of the ecological system and something that we need to learn to live with and utilize as a tool, as opposed to it's the Smokey the Bear, only you can prevent it. It's a horrible thing, put it out at all costs. As soon as you see it, stomp it out kind of idea. And it's a really hard, you can think about psychologically what it takes for people to start thinking about fire as something that they should be welcoming into their lives, right? That a lot of these people who, particularly in the wildland urban interface, you move there because it's beautiful and it's green and it's, it's lush and you want to be in the trees, and now this person wants to come through with a drip torch and turn it all black for the next 2.5 years, until the grass grows back up through it and put a bunch of smoke in the air and you have asthma and you can't breathe, right? You can imagine sort of the community relations challenges that land agencies have in getting fire on their landscape and also convincing private landowners to do fire treatments on their own land.
Fire NIMBYism, Fern says.
Fire NIMBYism, exactly.
So Emma, is sort of a follow-up with that in the chat. Your question was a little more about the jurisdictions and involving those and how can municipalities and the federal government better work with tribal governments from the management of fires. So yes, looking at indigenous practices can be helpful, although maybe not practical in some situations. But what about the governance issue of that? Do you have any research on working with tribal governments, or are they just another one of the layers?
No, we do. Several of the fires had tribal interests represented, either because one of the jurisdictions represented where the fire got on the landscape or threatened the landscape was either in trust lands or in reservation lands that were governed by tribes, and a lot of the tribes have their own fire operation services, and so they'll run fire operations on their lands, or they'll contract with the state to do fire operations for fires of a certain scale on their lands. So we've had conditions of that, and then we also have conditions where it's I'm forgetting the land designation, but it's essentially where it's federal land, but it's in tribal interest. So there's culturally significant, the land is deemed and recognized within the federal government as having cultural significance for a series of tribes. And so oftentimes the tribes are interested in the land, in the fire management processes that are happening on the federal lands. So, bulldozing through, culturally significant sites or habitats and of significance to the tribal members, those sorts of things, wanting to make sure that they have a seat at the operational decision table to at least make sure that the operations side of the fire is aware about those areas of significance to the tribe, and that there's some negotiation if there's alternatives to preserve those during the response itself. I don't know, does that kind of get it where I'm reading back here now?
That work. Okay, I'm seeing in the chat an interesting discussion about the use or the hiring of incarcerated populations to fight fires, which would probably primarily be incarcerated men in California. Thank you, Shannon, for that big, long explanation. It was very clarifying.
I was gonna say my old boss was actually a female firefighter back in the 90s in California as an incarcerated person.
Well, see, it's not what you kind of, my own stereotype is showing there, but yeah, good for her. So if you want to just kind of follow through with that, Shannon, since we've got you here and we don't always have you, you were speaking towards that issue of what is in the popular media, and you think, oh boy, they're hiring prisoners for $2 a day or something to fight fires. How terrible.
So it's not my area of expertise by any means. Branda might know a little bit more than I do. I've just been following kind of the news stories because there were policies in place that after they served their time and they were trained by CAL FIRE and they wanted to go out and actually get a job with CAL FIRE, depending on their criminal convictions, they couldn't. And so I think 2 years ago or a year ago, the governor changed that policy so that since they have all the training and the hours, that they are actually able to get employment. But I mean, the fact does remain that they are underpaid. I think they make between like $3 and $6 a day as an incarcerated individual working on a fire.
Yeah. Pierce, do you want to follow up with that? That was mostly, that issue brought up.
Yeah, I mean, I think you spoke to my point in that it is like a popular news story, and that's my experience with it. Is I'm pretty sure I just listened to like an NPR article about it. I don't claim to have done a deep amount of research into the topic, but it is curious because I mean, as part of that was a discussion that if they were paid, quote unquote, fair compensation, that the state of California just couldn't fight fires to the degree that they have been. And my questions tend to lead toward the economics of things. So I was just kind of curious about that side of it as well. It's like, if the staff that they're relying on were paid a wage that was commiserate with their work, then the state themselves couldn't even afford to do the work. And it's just, it's an interesting conundrum.
So and I like the statistics and the numbers as well. And I think I read that in like 2019, they used something like 3 million labor hours of incarcerated individuals. So if you take that 3 million hours and multiply it by like a livable wage, you're right. The budget would just be exponential.
Interesting conversation.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, that's great. It's nice to have you here, Shannon.
I don't know any of the stats about how much of the California, I know the CAL FIRE labor force is ginormous, but I didn't know how much of it was, and we do see a lot of on the fires we're at, the incarcerated crews out there. I do know, one of the big challenges in sort of co-managing generally of people that want to sort of operationally get involved, which is a different issue than sort of fair wage associated with that. But it is that getting everybody sort of trained up to a level of qualifications that everybody agrees with are acceptable. So there's an interesting movement that's happening around rangeland associations. Mostly, it's come mostly out of sort of the mountain west areas, but primarily areas that have a lot of BLM land, where ranchers will use those rangelands to feed their cattle. And so if the fire burns through there, it may look to you just like sage, scrub brush for as far as the eye can see, if anyone's ever drove across Nevada. But to them, that's a year's worth of food for the cows. And so if the fire runs through there and burns up all the grass, the ranchers are now stuck having to buy feed for the cattle herds, and that drives up the price, and talk about the economics. And so the ranchers got very interested in stopping the fires from burning across the rangelands, because it was having significant consequences for their ranches. And so they would get out there, and they also, these are not somebody, a guy with a pickup truck. These are people who have crews. They have airplanes, for crop dusting. Oftentimes they've got water tenders. They've got some pretty big equipment to bring to bear. But they were getting escorted off the fire lines by the federal agencies, because they weren't qualified to be on the fire lines. And so it was a liability to have people who are not qualified to be on fire lines part of the operation. And so there's been a lot of innovation happening in the last 10 to 15 years to try and figure out how to bring in unusual suspects, people that are, sort of not under the hierarchical command of control, traditionally of what we think about as fire organizations, who want to help. And this, I think, is an issue that is happening in disasters writ large. We think about, the Cajun Navy that became really active during, I think, got its most notoriety in Katrina, but has been active in Harvey and several of the other major hurricanes that we've had. These sort of resident group organized entities that now have enough organizational and institutional heft to them that they can be sort of part of the bigger organization, and they're represented on the organization, and we can get radios to them and all that sort of stuff. So as an organizational psychologist, one of the things that I find exciting is sort of how the institution is evolving to try and incorporate these untraditional actors within the incident. No, stop. Sorry, my dog's getting very impatient. Stop.
Great assistant you have. I think if we can squeeze in at least one more question really quickly. Chloe, you had a question about the use of Department of Transportation. Do you want to pose your question on that?
I do not have it in front of me. Do you want to ask?
Sure. You had your second question was, do departments of transportation typically play a role in COSs? Are they unique partners that have shown promising examples of successful disaster governance? So, departments of transportation, does that come up? We actually have some transportation planners.
So road closures is huge. And so that's where we see a lot of DOT and then highway patrol, like the whole roads phenomenon is something that I'm glad is not my job, because it gets really complex when smoke plumes are heading across freeways and you're trying to close off the Columbia Gorge because the fire's coming down the mountain and because the winds, so there's a lot that goes along with that in terms of safety in trying to get fire crews. Oftentimes another big role that they play is in the planning meetings, trying to figure out how we get crews. So crews tend to roll in very big trucks, and there's a lot of them. And so they're rolling down, and we're talking oftentimes very frequently in sort of remote mountain areas. So trying to figure out how we get them where they need to be to the fire without, one time we were on a fire where it was a sort of example of bad coordination. They had a community group of folks that were trying to evacuate people that had horses and didn't know how to trailer them, which apparently is a thing in California. There's a lot of people that have horses as pets that are not trailerable. And they tried to So there was a group of volunteers that went up to, who were experienced horse people, who went up to trailer the horses and evacuate them so that people could evacuate out of the area. And they sent them down the same road. So a whole bunch of trucks. So imagine a whole bunch of trucks and horse trailers coming down the same road as a whole bunch of fire trucks were trying to head up. And so they logged, they log jammed in the canyon, and that was kind of a thing. So anyway, that's so we see them in that. We're seeing them at the incident command post because of the coordination role they play.
Right. That's great. I can see that question sliding into Zuri's about the agriculture and livestock evacuation. Zuri, do you want to follow through with that? And maybe we can get a quick answer.
Yeah, I actually don't have my question in front of me, but I would love a quick answer. Do you mind reading it?
Sure. Let's see. I'm interested in agriculture and livestock evacuations, especially. What are your recommendations for needed policies to better support livestock owners when a fire strikes and they need to get their animals to safety? Anything specifically to address the needs of farmers with limited access to resources?
I don't know if that's a quick one. Don't farm ostriches is one of the, I hear evacuating ostriches is really hard to do.
Okay, keep that in mind.
There's so it looks very different. What I've seen in terms of that, it looks very different, like in California, where you're not dealing with the wide open spaces that you are in some of the Mountain West and Great Basin areas. That's about herding, right? It's about moving them by land. You see people out there moving them by land and just getting the fences out of the way to sort of race the herds into other land areas. You don't have that sort of option in a lot of the more populated, or some of the Oregon, Washington, California, those areas that are have a little bit more wildland urban interface. So I think the biggest thing in general is that you have to have these people at the table and communicating with the people who are going to be part of the fire organization way ahead of the fire organization, because during a fire is not the time to be trying to look through, the internet to figure out who you're supposed to call about blah, 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 blah. You really need to have those sorts of contact lists and things like that set up ahead of time, and have a plan for how you would get livestock out of there. And there are people who do that, but a lot of people just haven't really thought about it. And especially if they're smaller scale ranchers, they just may have not really thought about how they were going to get their animals out of there. And it is a big issue, both in livestock and agriculture, and also just people don't leave their animals. And a lot of people, particularly out west, have, big plots of land, and they have, horses as pets and goats, and, they've got a lot of stuff, and they don't want to leave the farm without and just leave their animals there. And so they end up staying, which creates interesting challenges for the firefighters who, are trying to figure out how to then keep those people from getting burnt over. So there's some creative stuff that's happening, but the biggest takeaway that I've seen is that you do not want to be thinking, if the first time you've thought, how am I going to get my animals out of here, is when there's smoke in the air, you're in a bad situation.